What's more terrifying than being alone in the woods at night? Knowing you're not alone. These 10 true horror stories of camping trips gone wrong will leave you questioning every crack of a twig and every shadow in the trees. But let me warn you, once you hear these stories, you'll never look at the woods the same way again. Camping should be an escape, a chance to get away from the chaos of the world, to relax under the stars and reconnect with nature. But for some, those serene woods hide something far more sinister, from strange disappearances to terrifying encounters with the unknown. These stories aren't just chilling, they really happened. So, whether you're a camping enthusiast or someone who prefers the safety of 4 walls, these tales will make you think twice before venturing into the wilderness. Again, are you ready? Let's begin. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. 4 college friends, Adam, Sarah, Jake, and Melanie, wanted a weekend away from lectures, exams, and the stress of their final semester. Adam, the self-proclaimed outdoorsman, suggested a spot deep in the woods of West Virginia. No cell service, no distractions, he promised. Just us and nature. They loaded up their gear and made the 2-hour drive to the trailhead. The forest was breathtaking, dense trees stretching toward the sky, the smell of pine heavy in the air, and the sound of birds chirping in the distance. The hike to their campsite took longer than expected. The trail was rugged, and the deeper they went, the quieter it became. Even the birdsong seemed to fade. By the time they reached the clearing, the sun was setting. They quickly set up their tents, started a fire, and cooked dinner. Laughter and the crackle of the fire filled the air, the unease from the hike long forgotten. But as the fire burned lower and the conversation dwindled, Jake noticed something strange. "Do you hear that?" he asked. The group paused, straining their ears. The forest was eerily silent. No rustling leaves, no distant animal calls, just silence. "Probably just the woods," Adam said dismissively. "They get quiet at night." That night, Jake struggled to sleep. The silence outside the tent felt oppressive, like it was pressing in on him. Around 2 a.m., he heard it, a faint, crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. He sat up, heart pounding, and whispered to Adam, who was snoring softly beside him. The sound grew louder, circling the campsite. Jake unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint shadows on the trees. And then he saw it. A figure stood just beyond the firelight, tall and unmoving. It wasn't holding a flashlight, and its silhouette was barely visible against the darkness. "Adam," Jake hissed, shaking his friend awake. By the time Adam groggily sat up and looked, the figure was gone. "You're just tired," Adam mumbled, lying back down. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The next morning, the group woke up to find Adam's tent empty. At first, they thought he was just up early, exploring or gathering firewood. But as the minutes ticked by and Adam didn't return, they began to worry. "His boots are still here," Melanie pointed out, gesturing to the neatly placed shoes outside his tent. "Maybe he went barefoot," Sarah suggested weakly, though her voice trembled. They searched the surrounding woods, calling Adam's name. But the forest felt different now. Darker, more oppressive. Every crack of a branch made them jump, and every shadow felt like it was hiding something. Then Jake found something that made his blood run cold. In the dirt near the edge of the clearing, he spotted a single footprint, but it wasn't human. It was larger, with long claw-like indentations. This has to be a bear, right?" Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Bears don't take people," Sarah whispered. Desperate, the group decided to split up and search in pairs. Jake and Melanie took the trail leading deeper into the woods, while Sarah stayed near the campsite, hoping Adam would return. As Jake and Melanie ventured further, the forest seemed to close in around them. The trees grew denser, their branches twisting unnaturally, and the air felt heavier with every step. Then they found Adam's hat hanging neatly on a low branch. "Adam!" Jake shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. A rustling sound came from ahead. Jake grabbed Melanie's arm, signaling her to stay quiet. The rustling grew louder, and they braced themselves. But it was just a deer bolting past them and disappearing into the trees. Relieved but shaken, they turned back toward the campsite, only to realize they'd lost the trail. The forest was unnervingly silent again, and every direction looked the same. Back at the campsite, Sarah sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The light cast flickering shadows on the trees, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, her name carried on the wind. "Adam," she called, standing up. The whisper came again, this time from the direction of the woods. Sarah grabbed a flashlight and ventured a few steps into the darkness. "Adam, if this is a joke, it's not funny," she said, her voice shaking. The beam of her flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, she saw him, Adam, standing motionless between two trees. "Adam!" she cried, running toward him. But as she got closer, her flashlight caught something horrifying. It wasn't Adam. The figure was tall, its limbs too long, its face obscured by shadows. It let out a low, guttural growl, and Sarah screamed, dropping the flashlight and running back to the campsite. Jake and Melanie finally found their way back to the clearing, only to find Sarah hysterical, babbling about a figure in the woods. "We need to leave now," she insisted. But as they packed up their gear, the noises began again. Footsteps circling the campsite, whispers just beyond the firelight. The group huddled together, too scared to move. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Then a piercing scream echoed through the forest. It was Adam's voice. Jake grabbed a stick from the fire, wielding it like a torch. "We have to find him," he said. But Sarah and Melanie refused, tears streaming down their faces. As dawn broke, the noises stopped, and the group fled the campsite, leaving most of their gear behind. Adam was never found. The police conducted a search, but no evidence of him or the creature was ever discovered. Jake, Sarah, and Melanie never spoke of the incident again, but each of them was haunted by the memory of that weekend. Years later, Jake returned to the woods, desperate for closure. Near the old campsite, he found something chilling. Adam's boots, neatly placed on a rock, just as they'd been the night he disappeared. You expect the forest to be quiet, peaceful even, but what if it wasn't? What if, instead of serenity, you found something darker, something that whispered your name and followed you home? This is the story of a family who ventured into the woods, only to find that some voices are best left unheard. Every year, Claire and Matt took their 10-year-old son, Tommy, camping. It was a family tradition, a chance to escape screens and noise and reconnect with each other. This year, they decided to try somewhere new, a remote clearing in the forests of Oregon, recommended by a friend. It was far from any trails, the kind of place where you wouldn't see another soul for miles. Perfect, or so they thought. The first day went smoothly. They pitched their tent, gathered firewood, and spent the evening roasting marshmallows under the stars. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest seemed to come alive with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. But as the fire burned low and the night deepened, the usual sounds of the forest seemed to fade. The air grew unnervingly still, and a strange, faint hum seemed to echo through the trees. Claire brushed it off as her imagination, but something about the silence made her uneasy. The next morning, Tommy wandered into the woods while his parents were packing up breakfast. He was an adventurous kid, always curious, always exploring. When he returned a few minutes later, his face was pale, his hands trembling. "What's wrong?" Claire asked, rushing to his side. "There's a lady in the trees," Tommy whispered, barely audible. "She told me to follow her." Matt laughed nervously. "You've been reading too many ghost stories, buddy." But Tommy's expression didn't change. "She said her name is Lila. She said she's lost, and she wants me to help her." Claire and Matt exchanged uneasy glances. They decided to keep Tommy close for the rest of the day, chalking it up to his imagination. But as the day went on, Claire started noticing things, strange markings on the trees, small childlike handprints pressed into the bark, as if someone had dipped their hands in ash. Whispers, faint, barely audible voices that seemed to come from all directions whenever the wind picked up. By sunset, the family was on edge. That night, as they sat by the fire, the whispers began again. This time, they were clearer. "Tommy," a voice called, soft and sing-song. Tommy froze, staring into the darkness. "It's her," he whispered. "She wants me to come." Matt grabbed his flashlight and shone it into the woods. The beam cut through the trees, revealing nothing but shadows. "It's just the wind," he said, though his voice betrayed his fear. But Claire wasn't convinced. "Wind doesn't call people's names," she muttered. As they settled into their tent for the night, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to circle the tent, moving closer with each pass. Claire clutched Tommy tightly, her heart racing. Matt tried to keep a brave face, but even he couldn't ignore the sound of soft footsteps outside. At one point they heard a faint giggle, high-pitched, almost childlike. "Who's out there?" Matt shouted, unzipping the tent and stepping outside. But the forest was empty. The next morning, the family decided to leave. But as they packed up, Tommy wandered off again. "Tommy!" Claire called, panic rising in her voice. They found him standing in a small clearing, staring up at a tree. Hanging from the branches were dozens of crude dolls made of sticks and twine. One of them had a piece of cloth tied around it, the same color as Tommy's shirt. "She made these," Tommy said flatly. "She told me." Matt yanked Tommy away, his face pale. "We're leaving. Now." As they hurried back to their campsite, they found more of the dolls tied to trees along the path. It was as if someone or something had been watching them the entire time. The whispers returned as they packed the car, louder and more desperate. "Tommy," the voice called. "Don't leave me." Matt slammed the trunk shut and climbed into the driver's seat. "Everyone in, now." As they sped down the dirt road, Tommy suddenly screamed. "There she is," he shouted, pointing out the window. Claire turned to see a figure standing at the edge of the trees. She was tall and thin, her face obscured by shadows. The family didn't stop until they reached the nearest town hours later. Back home, Tommy started sleepwalking. Claire would find him standing by the window at night, staring into the darkness. "She's here," he'd whisper. "She followed us." Claire and Matt moved shortly after, but the whispers never stopped. One morning, Claire found a small stick doll on their porch, tied with a piece of Tommy's shirt. What would you do if you stumbled upon a campsite in the woods that seemed frozen in time? Tents torn, belongings scattered, and no sign of the people who once stayed there. This is the story of a group of hikers who found such a place and discovered a terrifying truth hiding in the shadows. What happened to the campers before them is still a mystery, but their own survival is something they'll never forget. It was supposed to be a straightforward hike. 4 friends, Dave, Laura, Chris, and Megan, decided to spend the weekend exploring the Colorado Rockies. They were experienced hikers and loved the challenge of remote trails. The plan was to trek deep into the forest, camp for 2 nights, and then return. The trail was beautiful but demanding, winding through dense pine trees and rocky terrain. About halfway through their first day, the group noticed something odd. There were no sounds, no birds, no insects, not even the rustling of leaves in the wind. "Feels like the forest is holding its breath," Laura said, trying to laugh it off. They pushed on, determined to reach their intended campsite before nightfall. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trail, they came across something unexpected: an abandoned campsite. The campsite was eerie. 2 tents stood in disarray, one partially collapsed, the other torn open. Nearby, a small fire pit was filled with ash and charred wood, but the embers were cold, as if it had been extinguished days ago. Scattered around the site were belongings: a backpack with its contents spilled out, a flashlight, and a pair of hiking boots left neatly by one of the tents. "Where are the people?" Megan asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Chris picked up a journal lying open on a nearby log. The last entry sent chills down his spine. "We're being watched. They're out there, just beyond the trees. We shouldn't have come here." The group debated what to do. They hadn't seen anyone on the trail all day, and the campsite looked as though its occupants had left in a hurry. "Maybe they got lost," Dave suggested, though his tone was unconvincing. As night fell, the group decided to set up their own tents a short distance away, hoping to avoid whatever had scared the previous campers. But the uneasy feeling lingered. The forest was silent, save for the occasional crackle of their campfire. They sat close together, their voices hushed as they speculated about what had happened at the abandoned site. Around midnight, they heard it, a faint rustling sound, like someone moving through the trees. "Probably an animal," Chris said, trying to sound confident. But the sound didn't stop. It circled their campsite, moving closer and closer. Dave grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the trees. The beam caught something, a pair of glowing eyes, just for a second before they vanished. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice trembling. The group huddled closer, the fire their only source of comfort. But the rustling didn't return, and eventually they retreated to their tents. The next morning, they returned to the abandoned campsite to search for more clues. Chris found more pages of the journal tucked under a rock near the fire pit. The entries painted a grim picture. Day 1. Something feels off here. It's too quiet. Day 2. We saw someone watching us last night. just standing in the trees. Day 3. They're getting closer. We can't leave. They won't let us. Megan found a trail of footprints leading away from the site. The prints were strange, larger than a human's, with claw-like indentations. Whatever made these wasn't human, she said, her voice shaking. As they followed the footprints, the group noticed strange carvings in the trees, symbols they didn't recognize, etched deep into the bark. The trail ended abruptly at a steep drop-off, where a sheer rock face descended into darkness. "This is wrong," Laura said, stepping back. "We need to leave." As they turned to head back, the forest grew darker, even though it was midday. The silence was broken by faint whispers, growing louder with each step. Then came the laughter, high-pitched and childlike, echoing through the trees. "Run," Dave said, his voice barely audible. The group sprinted back toward their campsite, but the forest seemed to twist and stretch, the trees blending together in a disorienting blur. The laughter followed them, growing louder and more frenzied. Branches snapped around them, and shadows darted just beyond their vision. When they finally reached their campsite, they found it destroyed, tents shredded, their belongings scattered. Standing in the center of the wreckage was a figure. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its face hidden beneath a tattered hood. The group froze as the figure slowly turned toward them. Its eyes glowed faintly, and it raised a bony hand, pointing directly at them. Snapping out of their paralysis, the group bolted down the trail, abandoning everything. The laughter and whispers chased them, growing fainter as they neared the edge of the forest. When they finally emerged from the woods, gasping for breath, the sounds stopped. They reported the abandoned campsite to the authorities, but when search parties returned, there was no trace of it. The forest floor showed no signs of a fire pit, tents, or footprints. The group never went hiking again. Years later, Dave received a package in the mail. Inside was a single page torn from the journal they'd found. Written on it was a single line: "You shouldn't have left." You're alone in your tent, deep in the wilderness, miles away from a civilization. The fire's out, the night is silent, and you're about to fall asleep. Then you see it, something outside, moving, waiting. This is Emma's story, and it'll make you think twice about camping alone. Emma was a seasoned camper. For her, nothing compared to the solitude of nature, the fresh air, the rustle of trees, and the feeling of being completely alone. That weekend, she decided to camp near a remote lake in northern Canada. The area was perfect. Miles of untouched wilderness, crystal clear water, and no cell service. The first day was everything she hoped for. She pitched her tent near the water, cooked dinner over a small fire, and spent the evening watching the stars. By the time she climbed into her sleeping bag, the world was completely still. But as she lay there, listening to the gentle lapping of the lake, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Round midnight, Emma was jolted awake by a sound, a faint rustling just outside her tent. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the noise was deliberate, like something or someone moving slowly around her campsite. She grabbed her flashlight, her heart pounding, and aimed it at the tent wall. The beam cast a dim light through the fabric, and that's when she saw it. A shadow. It was faint, but unmistakable. A tall figure standing just outside. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. The shadow didn't move. Emma's mind raced. Was it an animal? Another camper? She hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. After what felt like an eternity, the shadow shifted and disappeared. Emma unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was silent. Convincing herself it was her imagination, she crawled back into her sleeping bag. But sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, Emma stepped out of her tent to find her campsite undisturbed. No footprints, no signs of an animal, nothing. Trying to shake off her unease, she spent the day hiking and exploring the area. The forest was beautiful, but she couldn't ignore the feeling of being watched. At one point, while filling her water bottle at the lake, she glanced up and saw something across the water. A figure standing among the trees. It was too far to make out any details, but it was tall and unmoving. She called out, but the figure didn't respond. When she looked again, it was gone. Emma hurried back to her campsite, her nerves fraying. She decided to leave first thing in the morning. As the sun set, Emma tried to calm herself with a fire and a cup of tea, but the forest felt different now, darker, quieter, and colder. She retreated to her tent early, zipping it up tightly. Hours passed, and the night grew still. Then the rustling began again. This time, it was louder, closer. Emma held her breath, gripping her flashlight. The sound circled the tent, slow and deliberate, as if whatever was outside was toying with her. Her flashlight flickered as she aimed it at the tent wall. The shadow was back, and it was larger now, its outline more defined. It leaned closer, and for a moment, Emma thought she saw a face, distorted and unnatural, pressing against the fabric of the tent. "Go away," she screamed, her voice cracking. The shadow froze. Then, in one swift motion, it darted away. Emma unzipped the tent, flashlight in hand, and stepped outside. The fire was out, and the forest was pitch black. She swept the beam across the trees, but saw nothing. Then she heard it, a low guttural growl. She turned toward the sound, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Two glowing eyes stared back at her from the darkness. Emma didn't wait. She grabbed her pack and ran, leaving her tent and supplies behind. Emma sprinted down the trail, the glowing eyes following her. Always just beyond the edge of her flashlight's beam, the forest seemed to close in around her, the trees twisting and looming like shadowy figures. She tripped over a root, falling hard, and scrambled to her feet just as the growl came again, louder this time. Finally, she saw it, the faint outline of the trailhead and her car beyond it. She pushed herself harder, her lungs burning, and didn't stop until she was inside, locking the doors behind her. As she drove away, her headlights illuminated the edge of the forest. For a brief moment, she saw it, a tall, thin figure with glowing eyes, watching her leave. Emma never returned to the woods. She reported the incident to the local authorities, but they dismissed it as a bear encounter. But Emma knew better. A week later, she received a package in the mail. Inside was a small, charred piece of fabric, part of her tent. There was no return address. Imagine sitting around a campfire with your friends, laughter echoing through the woods. Then, out of nowhere, someone steps into the firelight. A stranger. He doesn't speak, doesn't move, just stares. This is the story of a group of campers who encountered something, or someone that shouldn't have been there. And what they discovered still haunts them to this day. It started as a simple weekend getaway. 4 friends, Mike, Liz, Jenna, and Rob, decided to spend a few nights camping deep in the Smoky Mountains. The idea was to disconnect from their hectic lives, enjoy nature, and bond over campfire stories. First day was perfect. They hiked miles into the forest, following a lesser-known trail to ensure complete isolation. They found an idyllic clearing near a creek, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to touch the sky. As night fell, they built a roaring fire, roasted marshmallows, and swapped stories about their lives. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the crackling fire and the distant hum of crickets. But as the night deepened, the woods around them grew unnervingly quiet. Did it just get colder? Jenna asked, wrapping her jacket tighter. Probably just the mountain air, Mike replied, though he noticed it too. The warmth of the fire didn't seem to reach beyond their small circle. Around midnight, as they sat chatting and staring into the flames, they heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They froze, their laughter dying instantly. "Did you hear that?" Liz whispered, her eyes darting toward the darkness beyond, the firelight. Before anyone could answer, a man stepped into view. He was tall, with a wiry frame, wearing tattered, outdated clothes, a long coat and boots that looked decades old. A wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over his face, obscuring his features. "Hey there," Mike called out, nervously, trying to sound casual. "You lost?" The man didn't respond. He walked closer, his movements slow and deliberate until he was just outside the glow of the fire. "Do you need help?" Jenna asked, her voice trembling. The man finally stopped. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the fire, or maybe at them. The silence was unbearable. "You're welcome to sit," Rob offered, hesitantly, gesturing to a log near the fire. The man tilted his head slightly, almost like he was considering the offer. Then, without a word, he sat down. The group exchanged uneasy glances. The man's presence was unnerving, but none of them wanted to appear rude or afraid. "So, are you from around here?" Liz asked, breaking the silence. No response. "What brings you out this far?" Mike tried, forcing a smile. Again, nothing. The man just stared into the fire, his face still hidden beneath the shadow of his hat. His hands rested on his knees, motionless. Jenna whispered to Liz, "This is weird. We should ask him to leave." Before Liz could respond, the man's head snapped up, as if he'd heard them. He turned slightly, his face still obscured, and let out a low guttural hum. The sound sent a chill down their spines. "Okay, maybe it's time to call it a night," Mike said, standing up. "We've got an early hike tomorrow." The man didn't move. The group quickly retreated to their tents, leaving the man by the fire. None of them could sleep, their minds racing with unease. Hours passed, and the fire burned low. Mike finally gathered the courage to unzip his tent and peek outside. The man was gone. Relieved, Mike stepped out to stoke the fire and saw something chilling. In the dirt around the campsite were footprints, hundreds of them circling their tents. "Guys," he whispered loudly, waking the others. They emerged one by one, staring at the strange tracks. "What the hell is this?" Rob asked, his voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, they heard a laugh, high-pitched and echoing. It came from the woods, bouncing off the trees. Did he just laugh?" Jenna stammered. "No," Liz said, her voice barely audible. "It came from over there." She pointed to the opposite side of the clearing, then more laughter, this time closer. The group huddled together, scanning the darkness. But they couldn't see anything. Suddenly, the fire went out. Panic set in. The group scrambled to relight the fire, but the matches wouldn't catch. Then they saw him. The man stood at the edge of the clearing, his hat gone, revealing his face. It was pale and expressionless, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly. His mouth twisted into a grotesque grin as he raised a hand, pointing at them. "Run," Mike whispered, his voice trembling. But the man took a step forward, then another. His movements were slow, almost mechanical, as if he were toying with them. Finally, the group bolted, abandoning their gear and sprinting down the trail. The laughter followed them, growing louder and more maniacal with every step. They didn't stop running until they reached their car at the trailhead. Breathless and terrified, they piled in and sped away, leaving the Smoky Mountains behind. When they returned with authorities the next day, their campsite was gone. There were no tents, no footprints, just an empty clearing. But Mike swore he saw something as they drove away. A tall figure standing among the trees, his wide-brimmed hat casting a long shadow in the morning light. To this day, the group doesn't know who or what they encountered that night. Imagine hiking deep into the woods, miles away from civilization, and stumbling upon a place you were never meant to see, a clearing where something sinister unfolds under the moonlight. This is the story of two friends who found such a place and barely made it out alive. What they saw will haunt them forever. Liam and Ethan were childhood best friends who loved exploring the outdoors. Every summer, they picked a new trail to conquer. This year, they chose the remote Appalachian Mountains, an area known for its untouched beauty and eerie folklore. The hike started like any other. The air was crisp, the trees were lush, and the only sounds were the crunch of their boots on the trail and the occasional rustle of leaves. After hours of hiking, they came across an unmarked path veering off the main trail. It wasn't on their map, but the thrill of the unknown drew them in. "This is what we came for," Ethan said with a grin, leading the way. The path wound through dense forest, the canopy above growing thicker with each step. By late afternoon, they stumbled upon a clearing. At its center was a circle of stones, blackened by fire, surrounded by strange symbols carved into the ground. "What is this?" Liam asked, his voice hushed. Ethan shrugged, pulling out his phone to snap a picture. Probably just some old campsite or a weirdo art project. But Liam wasn't so sure. There was something about the place that felt wrong. As they examined the clearing, Liam noticed the carvings on the stones. They weren't random. They looked like symbols, intricate and deliberate, etched deep into the surface. "Looks like some kind of ritual site," he said uneasily. Ethan laughed. "You've been watching too many horror movies." They decided to set up camp a safe distance away, too tired to hike back before nightfall. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew unnervingly silent. Even the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves seemed to vanish. Around 11 p.m., the temperature dropped sharply. Liam, unable to sleep, stepped out of the tent to add wood to the fire. That's when he saw it, a faint, flickering light coming from the direction of the clearing. "Ethan," he whispered, shaking his friend awake. "What?" Ethan mumbled, groggy. "There's someone out there." They crept toward the clearing, keeping low and quiet. As they neared, the faint light grew brighter, revealing a group of hooded figures standing around the stone circle. Each figure held a torch, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods. They chanted in a language Liam and Ethan couldn't understand, low guttural sounds that sent chills down their spines. In the center of the circle was something even more disturbing, a crude wooden effigy. human-shaped and bound with rope. "We don't need to leave," Liam whispered, his voice trembling. But before they could retreat, one of the figures turned, as if sensing their presence. For a moment, they froze, hoping they hadn't been seen. But the figure raised its torch, pointing directly at them. The chanting stopped. Panic set in as the hooded figures began moving toward them, their torches casting long, flickering shadows across the trees. "Run!" Ethan shouted, grabbing Liam's arm. They bolted back toward their campsite. The sound of footsteps and snapping branches closed behind. The forest seemed to twist and shift around them. The once familiar trail, now a confusing maze. Every turn brought them deeper into the woods, the hooded figures' chants echoing in the distance. When they finally reached their campsite, it was destroyed. Their tent was slashed, their supplies scattered, and the fire pit smothered. In the dirt, someone had carved the same symbols they'd seen in the clearing. "We can't stay here," Liam said, his voice shaking. They grabbed what little they could and kept running, desperate to put as much distance as possible between them and the clearing. Hours later, just as the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, they saw it, a faint glimmer of the main trail ahead. Relief flooded them, and they quickened their pace. But as they neared the trail, they stopped dead in their tracks. Standing in their path were three hooded figures, their torches still burning despite the rising sun. Ethan stepped back, his voice barely a whisper. "What do we do?" The figures raised their torches in unison, pointing them toward the ground. Slowly, they stepped aside, as if inviting Liam and Ethan to pass. Too terrified to question it, the two friends ran, not stopping until they reached their car at the trailhead. Back in the safety of their home, Liam and Ethan tried to make sense of what had happened. But no matter how much they searched, they couldn't find any information about the symbols or rituals they'd witnessed. A week later, Ethan woke in the middle of the night to a faint, flickering light outside his bedroom window. When he looked, he saw a torch burning in the distance and a hooded figure watching him from the edge of the woods. Imagine camping in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but silence and darkness. Now imagine waking up to find your friend missing. No struggle, no signs of where they went, just gone. This is the story of Brian, a solo camper whose disappearance still defies explanation. Brian was the kind of person who thrived on solitude. A dedicated outdoorsman, he loved the peace and quiet that came with being miles away from the nearest person. In late September, he decided to camp in the remote backcountry of the Rockies. His destination was a small clearing by a stream, miles from any official trail. It was the kind of place that didn't show up on maps. A hidden gem he'd discovered during a previous hike. After hiking for hours, Brian set up camp in the clearing. He pitched his tent near the stream, gathered firewood, and cooked a simple dinner as the sun dipped below the mountains. The world around him was calm and serene, the air crisp with the first hints of autumn. As darkness fell, Brian felt a strange sense of unease. He couldn't place it. There were no strange sounds, no wildlife stirring, just an odd heaviness in the air. Shaking it off as exhaustion, he climbed into his tent and drifted off to sleep. Around 2 a.m., Brian woke up. Something had stirred him. A sound, faint but deliberate. It wasn't the rustling of leaves or the distant howl of wind. It was closer. He lay still, listening. The sound came again. A soft click, click, like someone or something tapping on the fabric of his tent. Probably just an animal, Brian muttered to himself, though his heart pounded in his chest. Grabbing his flashlight, he unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the stillness of the forest. Nothing seemed out of place, but as he scanned the area, he noticed something strange. His backpack, which had been propped up against a tree, was now sitting in the middle of the clearing. He stepped out cautiously, flashlight in hand. The backpack looked untouched. No rips, no signs of a struggle. It was as if someone had moved it and left it there. Feeling unnerved, Brian brought the pack back to his tent, secured the zipper, and tried to convince himself it was just the wind. The next morning, Brian woke up to find his backpack missing again. This time, it wasn't in the clearing. He searched the area, his frustration mounting. When he finally found it, it was at the edge of the stream, the straps neatly folded as if someone had placed it there. Inside, everything was accounted for, except for his map. "All right, this isn't funny," he muttered, scanning the tree line. But there was no one around. As the day went on, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Shadows seemed to linger in his peripheral vision, and the forest was unnervingly quiet. Determined to leave the next morning, he packed his gear early and settled in for one last night. The forest felt different that night. The usual sounds of nocturnal animals were absent, replaced by an eerie silence. As Brian lay in his tent, he heard it again, the tapping. This time, it was more insistent, moving around the tent in slow, deliberate circles. Grabbing his flashlight and knife, he shouted, "Who's out there?" The tapping stopped. For several minutes, there was only silence. Then, from the far side of the tent, a whisper, "You're not alone." Brian froze, every hair on his body standing on end. Summoning his courage, he unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The clearing was bathed in moonlight, and for a moment, everything looked normal. But then he saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and cloaked in shadows. Its face was obscured, but its eyes glowed faintly. reflecting the light of the moon. Brian didn't wait. He grabbed his pack and bolted into the woods, abandoning his tent and most of his supplies. Brian's disappearance was reported 3 days later when he failed to check in with his family. Search parties combed the area, but there was no trace of him. When they found his campsite, his tent was still standing, undisturbed. His flashlight and knife lay by the fire pit, but his backpack was gone. The only clue was a single note scrawled hastily on the back of a map. Don't follow the shadows. Months later, another group of hikers found a backpack in the same clearing. It was weathered and torn, but inside were items that belonged to Brian: his wallet, his compass, and his knife. But the map was missing. No one knows what happened to Brian, but locals now warn hikers to avoid that part of the forest. They say the shadows are still there, watching, waiting for the next camper to wander too close. You're camping in the middle of nowhere with a group of friends, surrounded by nothing but the dense forest and a crackling fire. Then, out of the darkness, you hear it. Laughter. Not the kind that puts you at ease, but a sound so unnatural it chills you to your core. This is the story of a scout troop who thought they were safe in the woods until they heard the laughter. In early summer, a scout troop of 8 boys and 2 leaders set out on a multi-day camping trip in the Pacific Northwest. Their destination was a remote site nestled deep within the forest, far from any roads or cell service. The group was excited. It was a tradition. Every year, they picked a different location, challenging themselves to go further off the grid. This year's spot was particularly secluded, chosen for its natural beauty and isolation. They arrived in the late afternoon, setting up camp in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The boys were full of energy, laughing and joking as they pitched their tents and gathered firewood. As night fell, the group sat around the fire, telling ghost stories. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows on the trees, but the boys laughed off their fears, comforted by the warmth of the fire and the presence of their friends. Little did they know, they weren't alone. Around midnight, the laughter died down, and the boys began retreating to their tents. The forest grew quieter, the fire burning low. That's when they heard it. At first, it was faint, barely audible over the crackling fire, a soft, high-pitched giggle coming from the trees. "Did you hear that?" one of the boys asked, sitting up straight. The others listened, their laughter fading into silence. A few seconds later, the giggle came again, this time louder, closer. "Probably just an animal," one of the leaders said, though his voice betrayed his unease. The boys tried to laugh it off, but the sound came again, echoing through the forest. It wasn't just a single laugh anymore. It was joined by others, overlapping and chaotic, as if an unseen crowd was surrounding them. Leaders told the boys to stay calm and stay close, but the tension was palpable. By 2 a.m., the laughter hadn't stopped. It seemed to move around the campsite, coming from different directions, growing louder and more frantic. One of the boys, a 13-year-old named Jake, peered out of his tent and froze. "There's someone out there," he whispered to his friend. In the faint glow of the dying fire, they saw shapes moving among the trees. They were small, childlike, but their movements were unnatural, jerky and fast, darting between the shadows. The leaders gathered, the boys in the center of the campsite, forming a protective circle. They shone flashlights into the forest, but the beams only seemed to deepen the darkness. Then the laughter stopped. For a few moments, the forest was silent. The group held their breath, straining to hear any sign of movement. Then a deep, guttural voice broke the silence. "Why are you here?" Terrified, the group decided to leave immediately. They hastily packed their gear, leaving behind anything they couldn't carry, and started down the trail in the dark. But the forest seemed different now. The path they had taken earlier was gone, replaced by dense undergrowth and unfamiliar trees. As they stumbled through the darkness, one of the boys tripped over something. It was a pile of stones arranged in a circle with strange symbols carved into the dirt around them. The same symbols began appearing everywhere, on tree trunks, rocks, even on the ground beneath their feet. "What is this?" one of the leaders whispered, his voice shaking. The laughter returned, louder than before, echoing all around them. Shadows darted between the trees, faster than their eyes could follow. Then, out of the darkness, one of the shapes stepped forward. It was a child, or at least it looked like one. A small figure with pale, almost translucent skin and wide, hollow eyes. It stared at them for a moment before letting out a laugh that didn't sound human. Panic set in, and the group broke into a run, ignoring the trail and plunging deeper into the forest. The laughter followed them, growing louder and more frenzied with every step. Jake stumbled and fell, screaming as the pale figure appeared in front of him. One of the leaders grabbed him, pulling him to his feet, and they kept running. Finally, after what felt like hours, they burst out of the forest and onto a dirt road. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of their ragged breathing. When they reached safety, they reported the incident to the authorities. A search team went back to the site, but found no trace of the symbols, the pale figures, or the laughter. The campsite was intact, as if they had never left. But carved into the stones around the fire pit were the words, "You shouldn't have come." Years later, Jake still dreams of the pale children. In his dreams, they stand at the edge of the forest, laughing and waiting for him to return. What would you do if a camping trip under the stars turned into a nightmare? Imagine seeing strange lights in the sky, at first beautiful, then terrifying as they come closer and closer. This is the story of Sarah and her friends whose stargazing trip ended in horror. What they encountered that night is something they'll never forget. And neither will you. Sarah and her friends, Tom, Emily, and Jake, were amateur astronomers who loved escaping the city for a clear view of the night sky. This time, they decided to camp in the Arizona desert, miles away from civilization. They arrived at their campsite just before sunset, setting up their tents in the vast openness of the desert. The air was dry, the horizon stretched endlessly, and the first stars were already starting to appear. "This is perfect," Emily said, setting up her telescope. "We'll have the best view of the meteor shower tonight." As darkness fell, the group lay on their backs, pointing out constellations and waiting for the show to begin. The meteor shower was breathtaking, streaks of light dancing across the sky. But then something unusual happened. One of the lights stopped moving. At first, they thought it was a plane, but the light didn't blink or move like an aircraft. It hovered perfectly still, far brighter than the stars around it. "Maybe it's a satellite," Jake suggested, squinting up at the light. "No way," Tom said. "Satellites don't just stop." As they watched, the light began to grow brighter, its glow pulsating in an almost hypnotic rhythm. Then, without warning, it shot across the sky at an impossible speed, before coming to a sudden stop directly above them. Emily laughed nervously. "Okay, now that's weird." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Something about the light felt wrong, unnatural. "What if it's watching us?" she whispered. The others laughed, but their unease was palpable. As they debated what the light could be, it began to descend, slowly at first, then faster. "Is it coming toward us?" Tom asked, his voice trembling. The light grew larger, revealing a strange, metallic object surrounded by a shimmering halo. It emitted no sound, but the air around them seemed to hum with energy. "Get in the tent," Jake shouted, pulling Emily toward the campsite. They scrambled into their tents, zipping them shut as the object hovered just above the ground, bathing the campsite in an eerie white light. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the ground and their bodies. Then they heard it, a series of clicks and whistles, like some kind of language. Sarah peeked through the tent flap and froze. Shadows were moving around the campsite. The shadows weren't human. They were tall, thin, and moved with a strange, jerky fluidity, their elongated limbs barely touching the ground. Their skin shimmered faintly in the light, as if reflecting the glow from the object above. Sarah clamped a hand over her mouth, to keep from screaming. The figures moved between the tents, their heads tilting as if listening. One of them stopped in front of her tent, its face inches from the fabric. Inside, Sarah could hear her friends whispering in panic. "Stay quiet," Jake hissed. But Emily let out a small gasp, and the figure turned sharply toward her tent. Suddenly, the light outside grew blinding, and the hum turned into a deafening roar. The figures stopped moving, standing perfectly still for a moment before vanishing into the light. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the object shot back to the sky, leaving the campsite in total darkness. The group emerged from their tents, shaken and terrified. The campsite was eerily silent, and the stars above seemed dimmer somehow. That wasn't real," Emily stammered, her hands trembling. "It was real," Sarah said, her voice firm. "And we need to leave now." As they packed up their gear, they noticed strange markings on the ground where the object had hovered. Circles and lines burned into the sand, forming an intricate pattern. Jake took a picture, but the image wouldn't save. His phone, like all their devices, was dead. The group returned to civilization, but their story was met with skepticism. No one believed them, dismissing it as a shared hallucination or an elaborate hoax. But Sarah knew the truth. She could still feel the hum in her bones, still hear the clicks and whistles in her dreams. Weeks later, she woke up to find a strange symbol carved into the wall above her bed, the same pattern that had been burned into the desert floor. She never camped again. Lakes are supposed to be tranquil, a place of peace and beauty. But what if something ancient lurked beneath the surface, watching, waiting? This is the story of a group of campers who discovered that not everything in the water should be disturbed. What they found at the bottom of that lake will haunt them forever. 4 friends, Rachel, Ben, Mia, and Eric, decided to spend a long weekend at a remote lake in Minnesota. The lake was tucked away in the wilderness, far from any towns or cell phone signals. Its pristine water and the surrounding pine forest made it the perfect escape. They arrived on a Friday afternoon, excited to unwind. Rachel and Ben set up the tents, while Mia and Eric inflated kayaks and prepared their fishing gear. The lake shimmered in the sunlight, its surface calm and inviting. "That water's so clear," Mia said, peering down from the dock. "You can see all the way to the bottom." But Ben, the group skeptic, chuckled. "Yeah, until it gets deep. You never know what's hiding down there." The comment hung in the air longer than anyone expected, leaving an uneasy silence. The first night went smoothly. They roasted marshmallows by the fire, swapped stories, and laughed under a sky full of stars. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. The next morning, Mia and Eric took the kayaks out, while Rachel and Ben stayed behind to fish from the dock. As Mia paddled toward the middle of the lake, she noticed something unusual. A series of ripples spreading out from a spot a few yards away. "Must be a big fish," she called to Eric. But as she approached, the ripples stopped. The water became eerily still, almost too still. Beneath her, Kaya, something massive moved, a shadow so large it darkened the water. Mia froze, gripping the paddle tightly. "Eric," she whispered, her voice shaking. "What?" Eric paddled closer, but by the time he reached her, the shadow was gone. "It was huge," Mia said, her face pale. "Bigger than any fish I've ever seen." Eric shrugged it off. "Probably just a log or something." But Mia couldn't shake the feeling that whatever she'd seen was alive and watching her. That evening, Rachel suggested they swim in the lake to cool off. Mia hesitated, but Ben teased her until she relented. The water was colder than they expected, and as they swam, Rachel noticed something strange on the lake bed. A faint glow, like soft green lights, deep beneath the surface. "Do you see that?" she asked, treading water. Eric swam closer, squinting. "Looks like lights." Ben dove down to investigate, but he couldn't get close enough to see clearly. "It's deeper than it looks," he said, surfacing for air. They decided to leave it for now. But Rachel felt uneasy. As they dried off, she thought she saw movement in the water, a ripple that seemed to follow them back to shore. That night, the group sat by the fire, the unease of the day lingering in the air. The lake, usually so calm, seemed different. The surface rippled occasionally, even though there was no wind. Around midnight, Ben decided to take a flashlight to the dock and look for the glowing lights again. "Come on, scaredy cats," he teased, urging the others to join him. Reluctantly, they followed. As they stood on the dock, shining their flashlights into the water, the glow appeared again, closer this time. Suddenly, the water erupted. A massive, serpentine creature burst from the lake, its slimy, scaled body glistening in the moonlight. Its eyes glowed green, and its elongated mouth was filled with razor-sharp teeth. The group screamed, scrambling to retreat. The creature let out a deep, guttural roar, its body twisting as it lunged toward the dock. Ben slipped, nearly falling into the water, but Eric grabbed him at the last second, pulling him to safety. "Run!" Rachel screamed. They bolted back to their campsite, the sound of the creature thrashing in the water echoing behind them. The group huddled in their tents, too terrified to sleep. Every splash and ripple from the lake sent them into a panic. Around 3 a.m., the sounds stopped. "I think it's gone," Eric whispered, but Rachel wasn't convinced. "It's waiting," she said. "It knows we're here." At dawn, they decided to leave. As they packed up, Rachel noticed something chilling. Their footprints from the day before were gone, replaced by long, deep grooves leading from the lake to their campsite. The creature had been there. As they loaded their gear into the car, the lake was calm again, as if nothing had happened. But as they drove away, Mia glanced back and saw the creature watching them from the shoreline. Its glowing eyes, the last thing she saw before the forest swallowed the view. The group never returned to the lake. They told their story to friends and family, but no one believed them. Months later, a news report surfaced about a missing camper in the same area. The only clue was a torn backpack found on the dock, its straps soaked in slimy green water. To this day, the lake remains untouched, its waters hiding something ancient, something that waits for anyone foolish enough to disturb it. If these stories gave you chills, had you questioning the shadows, or made you think twice about what's out there, hit subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. Remember, whether it's the woods, the water, or the sky, the world is full of dark secrets waiting to be uncovered.